Hi guys, it's Danny. Okay, today we're gonna discuss about setting back orchids, what it means, why does it happen, and what effects it has on our orchids, and of course, ways to avoid it. Now, this is a pretty lengthy and sensitive discussion. I'll try to be as coherent as possible, but do feel free to leave me a comment down below if I don't go into too much detail, if I am not explicit enough with something, but do watch the whole video. I might go over it. Now, what better way to show you what a setback is than to refer to my own orchids and refer to the mistakes I did and what I learned from them. Alrighty, so let's talk about what is a setback. Well, the name is pretty suggestive, I would say. A setback is a debalance in the growth of an orchid. As you might know, orchids grow continuously. They always get bigger. They always produce new growths or new leaves. So a setback influences the growth of an orchid in a negative way, actually. How it manifests? Well, it depends on the orchid. I have an example here. This is an encyclia. She is a sympodial orchid. She always produces new pseudobulbs. This orchid is set back because the new growth that is forming here is much smaller than the previous growth. So we consider this a setback because the normal growth pattern of this orchid has been disturbed somehow. Here we have another example of a setback, this time with a monopodial orchid. In this case, we don't have pseudobulbs, but we do have leaves. So as you can see, the older leaf on this orchid is much bigger than the newer leaf. So in this case, the growth pattern has been disturbed, so it influenced smaller growth on this orchid. In this case, the setback is even more visible. This is an older cane, and this is a newer cane. As you can see, there is a size difference. And also it can influence flowering. This cane produced 2 flowers last year for me, and this cane, which is visibly smaller, produced only 1 flower. So a setback can actually influence flowering as well. So with all these orchids, I think you can see a pattern. An orchid's nature is to grow bigger and bigger pseudobulbs or leaves, or at least as big as the previous growths. Because orchids do have a limited, let's say, length, you cannot get a 2-meter long orchid, but they do tend to grow bigger and bigger if they are young, or at least produce the same length of growth each year. A setback occurs when the growth is smaller than the previous growth of previous years. Okay, now that we know what a setback is, let's see what causes it. Well, I think it's pretty easy to assume that the disturbance refers to a disturbance of the vital organs of the orchid. Now, the vital organs of the orchid are roots, of course, because they absorb moisture and feed the plant, leaves, because they transform the moisture, water, and whatever the roots pick up into food for the other organs, and also pseudobulbs that store energy in the case of sympodial orchids, and also stems or axis in the case of the monopodial orchid, because the axis supports the leaves. Disturbance in pseudobulbs or axis leads to a staling growth. As you might have noticed, I'm not referring to flower spikes or flowers or buds in any way. Those are not vital organs of the particular individual. They do not contribute to the well-being of the individual. They do contribute to the well-being of the species by propagation, but we actually refer to individuals today. So here we have an example. This is the previous growth of this orchid, and this is the latest growth. You can actually see a major difference between them. If you watch my channel for a while, you might know the history of this orchid. When I purchased it, it did not have any roots, and furthermore, it was separated from the other pseudobulbs. So as I was saying, a disturbance with the roots, which are vital organs for the individual, can lead to a setback. And in my eyes, this is a clear sign of setback. Here is another case that I have and I actually featured in a previous video. This is my mini mark. The problem with this dude was that he lost a lot of leaves due to spider mites. So what happened afterwards were the creation of smaller leaves, much smaller than what he had. In time, though, things balanced out as more leaves were created. So in this case, the loss of leaves set back the orchid enough to produce very tiny leaves. Now, in very dramatic situations, you can actually lose the entire orchid, and I'll show you on the screen. I had an Oranges which lost her leaves due to a storm, and actually that Oranges died. So severe setbacks can actually lead to orchid death. Now, setbacks created by damage of vital organs are the worst setbacks you can have, but sometimes you can have normal setbacks as well, and they refer more to changes in environment. So for example, I have a Gongora orchid here. I purchased it last year. The first set of pseudobulbs it created are these ones, as you can see, but the latest pseudobulbs are really big compared to the previous ones. So what happened with this orchid is it kind of took a little bit of energy to establish into the new environment, so it created slightly shorter growths, but as it got adjusted it went into normal growing mode. So these sort of setbacks are not that severe. They are to be expected with some orchids, but I'll not necessarily talk about them because they don't necessarily pose a threat to our orchid. Alrighty, so to sum it all up, a setback can be caused by disturbing the vital organs of the orchid, and it's pretty easy to assume why this affects the entire orchid. So for example, loss of roots means dehydration, means less energy for new growth. And again, loss of leaves means less energy for new growth by disturbing the feeding process of the orchid. So with this knowledge, let's see how we can actually set back orchids. A way to set back an orchid is through repotting. Pretty easy to understand why. By repotting, we have a great risk of disturbing the roots or actually damage them. But this doesn't always happen. If we repot an orchid without damaging the root system too much, the orchid will not necessarily be very set back. However, this kind of depends on the orchid we are repotting actually. If we are repotting an orchid with very thin roots and very attached roots, I have here a Miltonia, it's easy to assume that these roots can be easily damaged when we repot this orchid. So a setback is more prone for this orchid than other orchids. However, when we deal with orchids with thicker roots, we have a lower chance to actually really damage and disturb them. This is pretty logical. We have huge hands. It's really hard for us to remove that media and that orchid from the pot if it has very brittle, thin roots. However, if the orchid has bigger roots, it's easier for us to be careful with them. So it's just something we have to live with actually. Now, while repotting is very good, and you know me, I like to repot every new orchid, it is true that if we make a very brutal repotting, we will set back the orchid. In which case, we kind of have to choose. If the media is very broken down, maybe full of pests and so on, we do kind of have to assume the setback in order for the orchid to be healthy. Because pests in the media can lead to setbacks as well. They attack roots, they damage roots. It's pretty much the same thing. Whether we repot it or not, the orchid will be set back because of the snails. So when we repot, we need to keep this in mind. Do we need to repot our orchid? If yes, okay, we're gonna repot it because it's crucial to repot no matter what the outcome will be. But if it's not crucial to repot, we shouldn't really repot because we are gonna set back probably the orchid if we have a very fine rooted orchid. And this actually leads me to why I decided to make this video. I recently watched a video from Saniti. I'll add her channel somewhere in the description so you can visit her and say hi and watch her videos because they're great. So she had a case of a Miltoniopsis which refused to bloom. I forgot to mention, when an orchid is set back, there is a high chance it will not bloom. It's pretty logical why. She does not have enough energy to create a proper growth, let alone bloom. But this doesn't happen with all orchids. It really depends on the type of orchid. Some orchids are more finicky, some orchids are more vigorous and so on, and some are just prone to blooming. But for the case of the Miltoniopsis, which is a finicky orchid, it's pretty easy to assume that if it is set back, it will have trouble with blooming. So Saniti had trouble with blooming her Miltoniopsis, and what she did was repot or change the whole environment around the root system almost every year in hopes it will help the orchid to bloom. But actually it had the opposite effect. The orchid did not bloom, and moreover it was so set back that the growth created didn't even mature. And luckily enough, even if I don't have a Miltoniopsis, I do have something close to it which did the exact same thing. So here we have an Oncidiopsis orchid. It's not a pure Miltoniopsis, it's a hybrid between an Oncidium and a Miltoniopsis. Far less finicky than a Miltoniopsis, but some traits are definitely there from the Miltoniopsis. So the history with this one is a pretty brutal one. I was not careful with it. I repotted it after I purchased it. It had snails, so the roots were damaged. Then I potted it in the orchid focus media. It did not do great. I repotted it in bark, and yet again now I needed to unpot it because I'm gonna move soon. So this orchid is severely set back. The effects are smaller pseudobulbs indeed, no blooms, but some pseudobulbs didn't even completely mature before starting a new growth. This denotes a lack of energy from the orchid, so pretty much this had the same fate with Sonides miltoniopsis. It was repotted almost every year, maybe even more than this, due to some mistakes that I did. I didn't try to encourage blooming, but I did repot it way too often. And this has very brittle roots, so every time I repotted it, even if I was forced to, I managed to destroy parts of her root system, and this led to severe setback, as you can see. So hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. If you absolutely must repot an orchid due to bad media and broken down and acidic media or inappropriate media or pests or rotten roots, or things of the sorts which do affect the orchid, it's okay to repot even if you're gonna set it back. It's a risk we have to assume for the well-being of the future growth. If, however, you just want to repot because you want to try out stuff every year or you want to try to make it bloom every year, that's a sure recipe for failure, because at some point that orchid will deplete itself. It might be in 2 years, it might be in 10, I don't know, but if you keep doing it, you're gonna deplete it, and obviously you're not gonna rebloom it. So I would suggest that if your orchid does not bloom, however, otherwise it's perfectly fine, it's growing roots, it's starting to grow bigger growths, just be patient. Maybe work on external factors such as temperature, maybe you need to adjust the temperature a bit, or the light and stuff like that, but do not disturb the roots if they're starting to look healthy, if they're starting to grow. And actually Sanity was mentioning that her miltoniopsis was growing roots quite okay in moss. However, now she unpotted it once again, and sadly I don't think things will pick up this year. Who knows, I might be wrong, but due to my experience, I'm just gonna say it, it's not gonna pick up because it was disturbed too many times. So I believe that you really should not disturb an orchid if you really don't have to. If something is starting to go well, why fix it? There's no reason to fix it. And I say this a lot, and I'm so sorry to say it. It's really frustrating to me as well, but all you need is patience. And I do have some cases. So here is my pink oncidium. You might know his story. If you don't, I'll add it in an info card somewhere. I do love this guy. When I purchased it, he was sick. I repotted him. The first growth did not bloom for me. However, I was patient. I did not repot him because the roots started to go really well, and the next growth it produced, even if not necessarily the prettiest, it did manage to bloom simply because the orchid was established, the root system started to become decent. There was really no point in me to mess with the media just because it didn't bloom. I just needed to wait for this orchid to get established, to pick up some energy, gain some energy, and invest into the flower spike. And luckily, I had good results, just because everything else was going great and the no blooming aspect was to be expected. Now, not all orchids are equal. Some are more finicky than others, and this is valid for any plant out there, let's call it like that. And here I have the case of my Maxillaria tenuifolia. She has been pretty mistreated along the years as well. However, she was not really that set back. You can see here the new pseudobulbs are really big, although she suffered 2 repottings in the last year. So even if I managed to disturb the root system, I didn't really have a setback because, well, Maxillaria tenuifolia. And you might have noticed that some orchids are easier to bounce back or faster to bounce back than others. And this is because they are different. It really depends on the hybrid or even the species. Now, another way to set back the orchid, but luckily this doesn't happen too often, is by cutting leaves when you're not supposed to cut leaves. If you have a little sunburn somewhere, it's okay to cut part of the leaf if that sunburn starts to infect or just looks ugly. But if you have a tiny little bit of damage on one leaf, don't cut the entire leaf, because the rest of the leaf functions normally and actually helps the orchid. It might not look pretty to your eyes, but especially if the orchid doesn't have too many leaves, and especially to monopodial orchids, don't go ahead and chop the leaves off your orchid, because your orchid absolutely needs them. They are vital for its growth. So with chopping leaves, again, you need to be careful. If you have an infection that spreads, yes, cut below the infection into good tissue, and I do have some tutorials on this. You can find them in the description below. But if you absolutely do not have to cut that leaf because it has a little sunburn here, then don't cut it. It's the best thing you can do. As you can see, I have some damage here, but it's not posing any threat to the leaf. It's not an infection. It looks unsightly, but I'm not even cutting that out because every bit of leaf actually helps my orchid, and this orchid has been through enough. So whatever little damage you see, just let it be. It's okay. Orchids in nature do have blemishes and all sorts of things. If it's something infectious that it's attacking the leaf, yeah, cut it, because it's gonna attack the entire orchid, not just the leaf. But if it's just a blemish, let it be. And please don't cut leaves because you hear on forums that it's gonna help the orchid bounce back. No, that's totally wrong. And I do have a video on this. I'll link it in the description again below if you're interested in that. The best thing that I can tell you is to never cut leaves as long as they're healthy, functioning. They will help the orchid. They're a vital organ. No need to cut them unless they pose a threat to the entire orchid. Okay, so let's draw a conclusion. I don't believe there are such species which are gonna be set back no matter what if you repot them. For example, the Angrecum, the Psychopsis, as long as you don't damage the root system entirely, there's no reason for them to be set back. However, I do believe that with any orchid, no matter species or hybrid, you will notice a setback, maybe a more severe one or a lighter one if you do damage one of the vital organs, roots in particular, leaves in particular, and then comes the pseudobulbs or the axis, which are not necessarily too damaged. We don't do that too often, but roots are always damaged when we repot excessively when we're not supposed to. So the best advice that I can give you is to look for health, not blooms. Blooms will come with health. Of course, you can go with the tricks of lowering temperature with Phalaenopsis orchid and so on, but really the vast majority of orchids don't have this trick that Phalaenopsis have. It all depends on their health, so strive to have healthy orchids rather than orchids which bloom. Think about the well-being of the orchid before you think about the flowers. Flowers are the least of your worries, really. But I do understand that you want to see flowers. Who doesn't? But if you don't see flowers right away, just be a little bit more patient. And I know it's frustrating, but try it, please. And don't go with repotting if your orchid doesn't bloom. Maybe it's not repotting that it needs. Maybe it's a little bit more light or patience to fully adjust to your environment. Alrighty, so I hope this helped you understand better what's going on. I have so many cases of setback orchids you wouldn't believe, and I wish somebody told me this before I started to do all sorts of crazy things. I do like to repot, but I don't like to repot when it's not necessary to repot. So for this reason, I'm actually switching to inorganic media, which does not break down, so I don't have to repot that often, because every time I repot, I risk damaging too many roots for my liking, really. So hope this helped. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have further questions or you'd like to talk more on this subject, just leave me a comment down below and I'll gladly respond. If you'd like to see more videos from me, simply subscribe to my channel. I post on a regular basis. Feel free to leave me any other suggestions for videos down below as well, whatever you'd like to share with me regarding orchids. If you click on the left side of your screen, you'll be directed to orchidnature.com, where you'll find care sheets, identification sheets, and also you can talk to us in the forum section. And on the right side of your screen, you can click to watch another orchid video. Thank you for joining. I'll see you next time. Bye!